I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. In June 1913, a little over a year since the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic, the Karluk, which was the flagship of a 3-vessel Canadian Arctic expedition, set off from British Columbia, near the southern tip of Vancouver Island. The expedition's mission was to conduct geographical and scientific exploration in an area lying between Alaska and the North Pole. The leader of the expedition was Vilhjalmur Stefansson, a Canadian-born anthropologist who had already spent several years studying the Inuit people, the Eskimos, in Arctic Canada. Stefansson had selected experienced Arctic mariner Robert Bartlett as captain of the Karluk. Sadly, shortly into its journey, the Karluk became trapped in ice on its way to a rendezvous point with the other 2 ships. Months later, the ship was crushed by the surrounding ice, and the small crew and passengers struggled to survive for months in the punishing Arctic weather. Nearly half of the people on board would not survive. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we'll be speaking with Buddy Levy, journalist and author of 8 books, with the most recent book being Empire of Ice and Stone, the disastrous and heroic voyage of the Karluk. Buddy will tell stories of the ill-fated Karluk and of the bravery and determination of its passengers and crew. He will also talk about the distinctly different personalities and leadership qualities of Stefansson and Bartlett. I'd now like to welcome Buddy Levy to our show. Welcome, Buddy.
James, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm going to start off by asking you, Buddy, where do you live now? Are you in Idaho, did I read?
Yes, I'm in Idaho, in the northern panhandle, a little town called Moscow, a college town, right on the border of the state of Washington.
Okay, now it is December 15th, and what kind of weather are you having out there right now?
Well, we've got a good little start on Christmas. Sledding, skiing, about a foot of snow on the ground and more on the way.
That's great. So have you always been from Idaho, or do you hail from somewhere else?
Yeah, good question. So both my parents were born and raised in New Orleans, and it turns out that my father was a very unconventional person. Most people don't leave New Orleans, actually, but he left and he went out west, and he ended up becoming a Nordic skier and ski racer, and was in the Olympics, in fact, in 1956 in Cortina in Nordic skiing. And all of that ended up getting us. He practiced medicine. He became a physician, and he practiced medicine and moved us to California in 1962. And then a job opened up in a ski town that he had been to before when he was younger in Sun Valley, Idaho. And so he moved our family to Sun Valley, Idaho in 1970. And I've been in Idaho ever since.
That's a really interesting background story, to think of your dad from New Orleans becoming a Nordic skier. It's like watching the Jamaican bobsled team, right?
Pretty much. He may be to this day, I'm not certain now, but for a long time, he was the only Louisianan to ever compete in the Winter Olympics. And so it was, he had gone to a small college called Western State College of Colorado. And that's where he began to love snow and skiing and the West.
That's great. How did he do at the Olympics?
Well, at that time, he did fine. He was one of the top Americans, but, they were quite a bit behind the Scandinavians, the Finns, the Norwegians, and the Swedes in Nordic skiing. The benefit was that he did have a Swedish Olympic coach, but they just were not as technically skilled, especially in jumping. If you watch the jumpers, how they have their hands behind their back and they're leaning out way forward in front of their skis. In the day that my dad was competing, the Americans had not cracked that code yet. So they were still sort of sticking their hands out in front of them and catching a little more wind and not going as far.
That's a great story. Now, buddy, you are, in addition to being an author of several books, you are also a professor of English at Washington State University. Tell me how your background, your educational background, and what introduced you to the love of writing.
Yeah, it's an interesting backstory, really. I grew up, like I said, in Ketchum, and I'm glad you brought up Washington State University. I'm in my 34th year, just about, starting here in January. But well before that, when I was young, in Ketchum, Idaho, Sun Valley area, I was at a private school, very innovative private school. In the first year of the school, there were 31 students total. So our classes were about 6 people in them. And there was a creative writing course we were doing creative writing. And I already had been introduced to Ernest Hemingway and his short fiction by my father. Sidebar note, my father was a good friend of Jack Hemingway, who was Ernest's eldest son. And my first babysitter in Ketchum, Idaho was Margot Hemingway, one of the three sisters, Margot, Marielle, and Muffet, who were I got to know them all. But one of my teachers noticed that the short story that I wrote was pretty good, as she thought. She was like, that's a pretty good story. Maybe you could work on that and try to get it published. And I didn't have any access to anyone at the time. And she said, well, we're really good friends with this local dignitary woman named Clara Spiegel. And Clara Spiegel was a member of I think she had married the man who was the Spiegel catalog magnate back in the day. And this woman, Clara Spiegel, was really interesting. She was, I think she'd written a couple novels. She was an editor. She had palled around with Ernest Hemingway and gone on safari with him. And so it got organized that I would go over to her house, which sat up on this little hill looking over the town of Ketchum. And she would work with me on my short story. And after a few sessions, probably 4, maybe 5, we got it pretty polished. And she said, you should send this to the local newspaper. And they ended up publishing my piece. It was called Opening Day for Danny. And it was a hunting story, a fictional hunting story, but based on some real life experiences that I'd had. And the piece got published in 2 parts. It was serialized. And, I think I really liked the process of making the story better and working with an editor. And I have to admit, I liked seeing my name in lights there, and knowing that I had put all that work into it and that it resulted in someone else besides my teacher thinking it was good.
What an interesting story. And then to have those relationships with the Hemingways. What a great way to get started in being interested in writing, huh?
Yeah, and I have to say, I read the Nick Adams stories pretty early on when I was probably 15. And there's an anecdote I like to tell people. When I was 16, I had this dear friend, Sarah, who I was kind of courting, I guess. And I gave her a copy of the Nick Adams stories with my, signed it and said, I'm a big fan of Ernest Hemingway's, and one day I want to be a writer too. And a few years ago, which was the Nick Adams stories were kind of an odd choice to give a girl that you're courting, but maybe it was the only book I could afford at the time. Or I had one lying around. Anyway, a couple of years ago, she took a picture of the inscription that I wrote, and it's 1976, and I was already had designs on being a writer, and she was very proud of me that I actually lived my dream.
Well, you certainly have become a writer, and a very, very good writer. And we're going to talk about your latest book, but I was looking at the list of the books that you've already written. Labyrinth of Ice. You wrote a book about a blind man's journey to kayak the Grand Canyon. Geronimo, Leadership Strategies of an American Warrior, and several other books, most of which seem to have the theme of some kind of adventure story or adventure story combined with a leadership story. I wanted to find out from you, what is it in your past and your history that has pointed you towards this type of a book?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because there are, even though I'm if you look at the list, it's all over the map in certain respects. It spans everything from a biography on the life of David Crockett to the first Europeans to descend the entire length of the Amazon, conquistadors, and then a couple of, I co-authored, as you mentioned, a book about the first blind man to summit Everest and to kayak down the Grand Canyon. And then I wrote a book with the sadly recently departed 2 days ago, Coach Mike Leach, who was an amazing, innovative coach of a number of different universities, including ours, Washington State. So we're still reeling from that. But yeah, and then I have jumped into this Arctic series that I'm working on. But I think it starts with the story, really. It starts with something I have to be pretty engaged in, an expansive, maybe even epic kind of tale that rivets me and that I believe will rivet readers, so that the canvas can be large. I mean, some of them have been larger than others. I mean, the conquest of the Americas by Cortez and the other conquistadors is a pretty large canvas. But yeah, at the core, I think it's people in difficult situations coming together and having to figure out how to get out of tough situations. A lot of my books have a survival component to it, and I'm not a survivalist or anything. I don't have a bug out bag in the garage, but I do like stories in which people are put into really difficult scenarios and have to MacGyver their way out in some way. And I will say that part of that is probably a result of I've had a kind of, in addition to being in academics and teaching for all these years, I had sort of these side hustles or side gigs that were really, really fun and interesting. And one of them was for about 10 years, and this is really before I started writing seriously, or I had just finished my first book, and I found my way into this very strange and compelling sport called adventure racing. And this sport was created by a Frenchman named Gerard Fusy, but it was popularized by Mark Burnett, the impresario who created The Apprentice, The Voice, and Survivor. So adventure racing entailed teams of 4 competing over about a week to 10 days, depending on where the course, in these far-flung locales across the globe. And they would it was multi-sport. So they would do kayaking, mountaineering, rappelling, sailing, sometimes caving, and the clock was usually continuous. So there was sleep deprivation involved. They were going and going and going. And following these teams around, I was writing as a journalist and getting to know all of the athletes very well and doing some smaller competitions myself, and watching people under duress and able to sort of press forward, mountain biking through the night with headlamps, with leeches all over them. And so that really, I think, spurred this interest in deep adventure, so I connect that to sort of when I finished my journalism phase of writing about adventure racing. That's when I started seriously writing these narrative histories.
Yes, and I also know that you had an experience in your lifetime that sort of piqued your interest in, other than your dad being a Nordic skier, that piqued your interest in the icy climate adventure. Could you tell us about that experience that you had?
Sure. So during one of the last races that I went to as a journalist, I had found out that this remarkable blind man named Eric Weinmayer was going to be competing in Greenland. And I thought, well, this is interesting in a number of ways. One is, how is a blind man going to compete in an adventure race? That was my first thought. And my second thought was, wow, I want to go to Greenland. What's Greenland like, And so these are both happening simultaneously. So I managed to wrangle my way in as a journalist and embed myself with Eric Weinmayer's team. And so I was covering it for a couple of magazines that were interested in adventure sports. So when I got to Greenland, I really hit it off with Eric and his team and figured out pretty quickly what just a miraculous person that he was, not only as an athlete, but as a thinker and as a human being, and also how courageous he was to be doing these, he was paddling through these fjords, and he was trekking. There was no trails in Greenland. I mean, it's basically bushwhacking everywhere. And so as I tromped along with him for a week, I was initially just really impressed with him. And then there were other people along the way that we met, other teammates, including this woman that I met named Ingrid Asa. And she was a Norwegian who was fascinated, and a Nordic skier herself. And we started talking about my dad and Nordic skiing and the famous Norwegians. And she said, well, have you heard about Fridtjof Nansen? And I said, no, I have not. And she gave me a book called The First Crossing of Greenland. And it was about this man, Fridtjof Nansen, who skied across Greenland, determined that it was an island. And then as I started to read about him, I mean, the man, he was a Nobel Prize winner for humanitarianism. He's just an absolute, he's a household word in Norway. And then I started reading about these other things that he did in Arctic exploration by building this ship, the Fram, and intentionally encasing himself in ice and drifting for a year. And I was so hooked on this stuff, And so I just started reading and reading. And then I began to stumble upon these stories that I thought, hey, maybe I could tell those in my way. And it really unlocked a kind of, what'll end up being a 3-book period of my life, in good part thanks to Ingrid handing me a book.
Now, your book, Empire of Ice and Stone, The Disastrous and Heroic Voyage of the Karluk. Buddy, it's riveting, absolutely riveting, filled with rich detail, and you feel like you're on board that ship and along for the adventure. But before I start to ask questions about my experience within the book, tell us a little overview of what the book is about, just a general overview, because we want people to get the book.
Oh, sure. Thanks. And I appreciate the kind words about the writing. One of the things I try to do, is to really get the reader there on the ground or on the ice and feeling as if they are a part of the expedition themselves, or short of that, feeling like they're watching it on a big movie screen where it's cinematic in scope. So I try to do that. Yeah, the overview is that in 1913, this very interesting impresario named Vilhjalmur Stefansson, who has just returned from 4 years in the Arctic himself doing science and ethnology, he comes back and decides on this new expedition, the Canadian Arctic expedition, and he's going to take a 3-ship armada, the best ice master in the world, a guy named Bob Bartlett from Newfoundland, and a bunch of scientists, and take them over Point Barrow, Alaska, and above the Canadian Yukon and Alaska into these islands, and try to find out a couple of things. One, there was a landmass that Robert Peary had presumably spotted from Ellesmere Island, and it's been named Crocker Land, and it's sort of this mythical thing that people are thinking there's going to be new land to be discovered. So there's that. And there's the potential for encountering what Stefansson in 1912 is calling these blonde Eskimos, which are Inuit peoples that he says have blue eyes, blonde hair, and are probably descendants of Eric the Red and Leif Erikson. And so there's that sort of tantalizing mythos going on when Stefansson comes back. And so in Canada at this time has not embarked on a major polar expedition of this magnitude where you've got multiple ships and a couple dozen scientists. So that was the sort of nutshell, as far as the impetus for the journey to begin with. And they were supposed to be up there for 2 to 4 years, depending on how things went. So it ends up being called the Canadian Arctic expedition, 1913 to 1918. But the story that I primarily tell all takes place within a year, other than the epilogue and back matter. But it's a lot happens in a year, I'll tell you that.
Oh, it certainly does. And the most interesting part of the book that I found, other than the fact that you actually experience what these passengers went through, but you get a really keen study of the major characters, Stefansson and Bartlett, as leaders, as people. It kind of puts you into a chair to kind of sit and review their leadership styles and how they were viewed by their contemporaries, and of course the people on the ship and on the expedition with them. Let's talk about those two characters. Personality wise and leadership wise, how would you summarize Bob Bartlett?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I do sort of position the book around, I begin with those two men. They're the first people that you meet in the book. And that was intentional, because they approach their decisions very differently. So I look at Captain Bob Bartlett. He was a well-known Newfoundland captain who came from this legendary family. They were called the Bartletts of Brigus. He had his uncles and his father and his grandfather were all really well known in the whaling and sealing and cod fisheries in Newfoundland. They were master mariners. It takes a very long time. So this man, Bartlett, was really experienced when he came to the Karluk. He had also previously been on a number of expeditions as the captain of Robert Peary's ship, the Roosevelt, going in search of the North Pole. So he had the credentials to lead men in very difficult situations. Now, Bartlett was funny, gregarious, kind of cantankerous. He swore a lot. But he was also incredibly generous with his men. And you have to realize when we get into it that the passenger list on the Karluk was unconventional in certain ways, because there were crew members who were, in charge of doing what was needed to be done on the ship. And then there were these scientists who were sort of there accidentally, because some of the members ended up on the wrong ship. And then there was an Inuit family who Stefansson had hired to bring along for dog sled driving, hunting, and sewing clothing. And so you got this strange mishmash of people. And Bartlett was really good at figuring out how the dynamics of personalities, how people work together, where they should be bunking and sleeping, what kind of workloads needed to be done. And he was a highly experienced captain who knew the order of a ship and what needed to take place so that people got along. Now, Stefansson, Vilhjalmur Stefansson, totally different character. He was also Canadian born, but he had been raised in North Dakota. They had moved there. His family had moved there after a series of traumatic events that happened in Manitoba. They lost some family members in a flood, and they moved to North Dakota. And Stefansson was this guy who was highly intellectual, even considering he grew up in a kind of the traditional, like, one-room schoolhouse situation. And but he really quickly went through. He went to the University of North Dakota. He ended up getting kicked out of there for being truant, and he was truant because he was substitute teaching on the side to make some money. But he went to Iowa, the University of Iowa, finished his undergraduate degree there within a year after being expelled from North Dakota, and then he went to graduate school at Harvard. So what I learned about him was, in that period of his upbringing, was his chameleon-like nature. He was able to shapeshift almost with what needed to happen, with what needed to be done. He would sort of be whoever people wanted him to be, but all the time he had his own goals, right? And so this ends up surfacing in what happens in the story, because Bartlett and Stefansson, in the scope of the Canadian Arctic expedition, are only really together for a few months before things go so far south so quickly that they're separated. But then I still follow both of the men and their decisions, moving back and forth for a while between what they're doing.
Yes, I wanted to comment on what you said about Bartlett, that he was aware of the personalities of the people he was in charge of, basically. And the way that that came out was, and I noticed this, he was very concerned about morale. There's a lot to do with keeping the morale good. He helped organize games. He gave out prizes. He, shared his whiskey and cigars with people. And you mentioned about the personalities. He would be making comments such as, this particular crew member or passenger seems to be acting a little strange lately. Let's keep an eye on him. This one here seems a little bit down or whatever. So you think of a captain, you think it's just going to be this rigid, hey, we're out at sea. We're going to, navigation's important. The condition of the ship is important. But he seemed to be like a holistic leader. He had his pulse on every part of the crew, and he was an amazing survivalist, just the way he organized the cargo and the supplies and when they would come off the ship, when they go on the ship, what about the dogs, all those things. It was just amazing to me, this guy. And I really thought to myself, as you mentioned, Bartlett and Stefansson separate pretty early in the story, but I can only imagine what would have happened if they had to stay on the ship the whole time together. What would have happened is what they're such different people. Any thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because so Bartlett was one of the main differences of these men is that, Bartlett was a mariner, a master mariner, which takes 6 years of continuous life on a ship and then written examinations. And Stefansson had spent some time on ships going to the Arctic, but he was not a mariner per se. And so I think that would have been really, really difficult because you really only want one actual leader of the ship, and that's usually the captain. And so had Stefansson stayed around longer, and we can get into that, what his decision was to leave and why. But I wonder, it worries me if more people, it might have been worse because he might have tried to take more members ashore once they were floating, and that could have been disastrous because Stefansson was really, really good at traveling in small teams, using Inuit practices and technique. But in terms of, managing 24 people and their varied personalities, he was less successful. And I'm glad you brought that up about Bartlett's intuitions about the members and their characteristics and personalities, because Bartlett fully understood in this period, when a ship gets, so just to back it up a second, the Karluk, after a week or two of leaving Alaska, the ship, the Karluk, the flagship, is beset or nipped. It's locked in a 1.5 mile square of ice that encases it, and it's not going under its own power. It's floating toward the northwest, away from shore and out into the Arctic Ocean at about 20 to 60 miles a day on the wind and current, with no ability to control where it's headed. And so Bartlett fully understands, from his reading, his deep knowledge of other expeditions that have been frozen in, what can happen on a ship when people, not only that, as the Arctic night, what they call the long night, begins to lock in, which is maybe 60 to 80 days of near total darkness when the sun finally goes down. And so there are tons of records and stories of it's where the term cabin fever comes in, where people begin to get depressed, anxious, and they are not behaving in normal ways, and there are sometimes there's suicide, there's mutiny. So Bartlett is fully cognizant of the potential of that happening, which is partly why he understands that we have to keep these men active, doing things, participating with each other, having evenings together. And he's very on that. He completely understands the potential for just carnage out there.
Yeah, there's one mention of one of the passengers who was acting very strangely, and to the point I think he was making other people very nervous. Once he was on land or on the ice or off the ship, I should say, he returned to normal pretty much because he was getting maybe that cabin fever. But it seemed Bartlett had it definitely, he knew what was going on. I rarely seem to get a sense that he's totally rattled. I mean, even when some pretty scary stuff happens, at least he doesn't appear to his people, the people on the ship he's in charge of or responsible for, get to see him totally like, oh my gosh, we're all gonna die, something like that. He kept it cool. I always think about if I were in a situation where I was in battle and I was in a foxhole with somebody, I think I'd want to be in it with Bob Bartlett.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. You've hit on something, and he is unflappable. There are times, and as you get into the book, and they're floating encased in ice, and then on the cover you can see, if you look at the cover of the book, the Karluk is in bad straits, right? It's going to be crushed, and it is. And so at a certain point, this is maybe after 4 months of drifting, and you mentioned Bartlett's organizational skills, so he sees the writing on the wall, and he has everyone offload hundreds of thousands of pounds of food and coal and gear, sleds. They manufactured more sleds on the ship while they were floating. He has the Inuit family, Karluk, and his wife, Karluk, and the kids are sewing Arctic clothing. They've been hired to do so, and thank goodness they do. And Bartlett has selected a spot on the ice where they're going to offload all this stuff. So in the eventuality of the ship being crushed, they have a place, they build igloos, and they have a place where they can stay until it gets light enough for them to maybe make a dash for land across this buckled sea ice. So he was very organized in that respect, and it's a good thing he was, because in January of 1914, after celebrating Christmas and New Year's on the ship, they are crushed, and they watch the ship go down. And it's funny you mentioned that about Bartlett. He also had this incredible flair for the dramatic. He in one of my favorite scenes in the whole book, when he's the last man on the ship, the last person on the ship, and he goes into the galley, and there's a gramophone, and he starts playing record after record, and after each record is done, he kind of theatrically throws the record into the fireplace. And then as it gets, the water's starting to wash into the boiler room, and he puts on Chopin's Funeral March, and then goes up onto the rail and stands there as the notes are drifting into the Arctic wind, almost as if he knows he's being filmed in a movie, And then he steps off right as the Karluk is about to go down, and everybody watches this ship sink into this hole in the ice, and the flag and the mast go down, and then there's this giant puff of steam where the steam spout is finally sunk, and it's just poof. And now there's 22 people, 32 dogs, a kitten, and everyone just standing on the ice going, what are we going to do now?
You couldn't make that up. When I heard that book, oh my goodness, this guy's cool as a cucumber. And it reminded me of like the Titanic, when the little orchestra was playing as the Titanic sank. I thought about that.
Well, interestingly, I mean, the movie hadn't come out, but the Titanic had sunk 1 year before this happened, and everyone, of course, who has anything to do with the Arctic North and icebergs and ships knows about the Titanic. So Bartlett, clearly, it was on a lot of people's minds. Actually, many of the diaries bring it up. It's like, I hope we do not suffer the same fate as the Titanic, and yet they do.
Yeah, it's fresh in everybody's memory. Just to back up a drop, tell us about the Karluk itself. What kind of a ship was it?
Right. So the Karluk was about a 30-year-old sealing whaling vessel. Karluk is an Aleut word for fish. And so it had been used in the sealing salmon industry and whaling industry. And Stefansson procured this ship for a really good price, because the whaling industry was in a bit of decline at that time. And, he also procured two other ships. The Karluk was about 129 feet long, but it didn't have a very powerful engine. In fact, the chief engineer, John Moreau, joked to Bartlett that the engine had about as much power as an old coffee pot. And, which isn't a really great confidence builder when you're going to be moving through giant chunks of ice floating around. But I have to say, in defense of Stefansson, the initial plan of the expedition was to stay above the Alaskan and Canadian northern coast and go and try to get over to this other island called Herschel Island, and then regroup and reorganize all their gear, and then try to figure out where they were going to go. And so the intention was never for the Karluk to have modern ice breaking capabilities, but it was still undergunned in terms of its power. And Bartlett made them stop in Alaska and have some of the it had needed to be resheathed in the bow so that it could bear ice bucking. And so, it was also in sort of bad condition, and it was too small for the number of people that ended up on it. And there are images in the book. There's 55 images in this book, and some of them are from the crow's nest looking down, and you can see how crowded everything was on the top deck. I mean, they have tons of coal bags, and canoes are strapped, and these umiaks, they're skin boats, and they're, it was a bit of a cluster. So the Karluk was probably not enough ship for the job it ended up having to do.
Yeah, but I think it really gave it its all, didn't it? Given the ship that it was and its age, and it wasn't exactly the right ship, that it hung in there for quite a while, though, didn't it?
Absolutely. And, Bartlett did everything he could. Numerous times, the picture on the cover, they have buttressed the sides with giant ice blocks, and they've actually managed to raise it up a little bit so that the pressure that's encroaching on it from all sides is relieved some. But at a certain point, we're talking about massive pressures of giant ice flows that are floating around, and they begin to buttress up and smash into the other sides of the ice that the Karluk is within. And very few ships in that day had the capacity to withstand that kind of pressure. I will say that I'm always surprised that they didn't, nobody figured out that Nansen had it completely dialed, because when Fridtjof Nansen built the ship called the Fram for this very purpose, he created it with a rounded hull so that when the ice invariably encased you, it would instead of crushing the sides of the ship, it would just lift the ship right up, and then the ship's riding on the ice. And so your vessel is like a hotel. You've got a year's worth of food and you've got warmth. And so nobody, I mean, that ship was especially built to do that. And so what ended up happening for these other expeditions is they were just picking up ships that they could, and they usually had limited budgets too. I will say that, Stefansson was spending the Canadian government's money, and so he didn't have the time to go build a special ship.
I noticed he was spending a lot of money.
Yeah, he ends up spending something like 600,000 Canadian dollars in 1913, which I think translated to something like 10 million bucks.
Yeah, was there an auditing department?
Yes, there was. Yeah.
So can you give us a bit of a hint on why Stefansson parted company with the Karluk?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, because this stuff happens quite early on. And, I look at the book in kind of in three parts. There's the convening and getting in the Karluk, then starting out, then Stefansson makes his departure, and then Bartlett has to get the survivors to this place called Wrangel Island. Maybe it's four parts. And then Bartlett goes on his own mythic quest journey to try to find help and get the survivors rescued. But the decision that Stefansson makes, sort of the crux decision of the book in a lot of ways, is that when they're encased in ice, it's September 1913, and they're still within striking distance of land. But I have to tell you that most of the people on the ship, there's a handful who have traveled on sea ice, but most have not. And so Stefansson tells Bartlett on September 20th, 1913, that he's going on a caribou hunting trip, and that the rationale is that he needs fresh meat because they're going to be stuck for a long time, and they're going to need fresh meat to thwart scurvy, which is reasonable thinking. The problem is that he took a couple of scientists who were actually supposed to be on these other ships. he took two of the best hunters that they had hired on in Barrow, Alaska, and he takes a dozen of the best dogs. And he says to Bartlett, I'm going to be gone for about 10 days to 2 weeks, should no disaster occur. And, Bartlett's sort of a head scratcher there, like, I don't know what he means. He couldn't have known, Stefansson could not have known what ends up happening, which is that one day after he leaves the ship, this massive storm blows in. Stefansson is left stranded on this tiny island, Jones Island, I think it's called, a few miles off the coast of Alaska. And meanwhile, the Karluk goes careening into the Arctic Ocean at 20 to 30 to 60 miles a day. And by the time the clouds part and the sun is out and Stefansson can see anything, it's like, dude, where's my ship? It's gone. And he actually, it's funny because there's some driftwood on this little island. He builds a 15-foot tall observation tower. And there's this great image of him in this other book where he's like standing up there looking through these binoculars, and the Karluk is gone towards Siberia,
Gosh, it's terrifying when you think of it. But as you go about reading the book, you get an idea that Stefansson's true self starts to come out as far as what he wants to do, what he wants to accomplish. And there's a little bit of a sense of a disinterest in really what happened to the Karluk.
Yeah, I mean, so what I do in the book, from that moment that they're separated, I stick with Stefansson for a little while because he ends up trying to, he's bound by a contract with the Canadian government to do all of this science. And so he discovers that the two other ships, the Mary Sachs and the Alaska, are safe in this small harbor off the coast of northern Canada. But Stefansson decides, okay, all is not lost for me. I'm going to continue the science, and I'm going to try to regroup and grab some of the scientists and go continue working on the project. But as far as the Karluk is concerned, it's either he says something like, it will show up, either it or its wreckage, and he realizes that practically speaking, there's nothing, because of how inaccessible that section of the world is. The ice only is open up and navigable for like 6 weeks a year. So now, of course, it's a little more than that. But at the time, 6 to 8 weeks a year. So Stefansson reasonably and practically concludes there's nothing I can do about it now. However, he doesn't really hurry to get the word out to the Canadian government. He waits and knows that it's going to take dog sled teams to bring mail. It's going to be months before they even respond to him. And at that point, I then join and stay with the Karluk, because at that point, Bartlett has a real dilemma on his hands, and he has to figure out how to get all these people from this shipwreck camp that they named the camp where the Karluk sank, shipwreck camp. It's floating, but they get glimpses of this place, Wrangel Island, which is this landmass above northern Siberia that they figure when the light comes back in the spring, they might be able to get there. He might be able to get them there in small teams. And he does this really organized relay system of they can't carry everything. This is the problem. They can only carry a certain amount of food because it weighs so much, food and fuel. And they do know from reading this pilot book that they have, and from these other expeditions that have people had landed on Wrangel Island before, they know that while it doesn't have trees, it has driftwood that has floated from other places. So they might be okay as far as being able to have fires, but they can't guarantee how much food they'll be able to procure. They do know that there are probably walrus and polar bears and Arctic foxes and some bird life, but they do need to try to bring as much food as they can. And so there's this ordeal of Bartlett taking them there over a couple of week period. And there's adventures within adventures and ice cracking and under the igloos. And I mean, and I will say that not everyone makes it, as it turns out. And then, without giving too much away, I'm okay with this. Some of the members make it to Wrangel Island, at which point Bartlett makes the next major leadership decision, which is they're in terrible condition by the time they get there. Many of them, they have frostbite, they're malnourished, they're exhausted, and they're hypothermic. And then Bartlett knows that they're not all going to be able to come with him. So he needs to take the best remaining hunter, this guy Kadektovic, he's only 19 years old, and strike across the long strait, this body of water, but now sea ice, 100 miles to the Siberian mainland and then travel maybe 500 or 600 more miles to the end of Siberia, where he can maybe catch a ship and get back to Alaska and then effect a rescue mission, because if they don't get to them by late August or September of that year, they're all going to die.
When I think of reading the book and knowing the little I do know about the Arctic, it's probably just about the most harsh weather that can be thrown at a human being, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are places in northern Siberia that are the coldest inhabited places on Earth, and Wrangel Island is 100 miles north of that. But there's no inhabitants there. So, and also the thing about it is that what people don't really usually understand, or unless they've been up there, is that you kind of envision the ice being this extended rink-like surface that's flat and you can just skate across, But where these it's almost like tectonic plates of ice are ramming and crashing into one another. And when they get near land masses, the big pieces of ice stop, and then the forces make these rupture where they're called pressure ridges. So they're upthrust rumble or crumbles of giant boulders. Some of them are these ridges are over 100 feet high. And so as Bartlett is trying to lead them across, they're encountering sections where there's miles of these pressure ridges that they have to hack their way through with ice axes and shovels and picks, and then build a little trail, that goes over. So it's really quite an ordeal. And at the same time, the ice is opening up, creating fissures and what are called leads of open water at any time. There's almost no way of predicting it. And so you can be moving along, and then all of a sudden you hear it screeching and wailing and rupturing. And then the ice is breaking beneath your feet, and you have to scurry to a safer area. It's incredible.
Doesn't sound like a good vacation spot.
I mean, and not only that, yeah, you're talking about that when they finally make it to Wrangel Island, in some of the literature, there has been, I discovered the lowest recorded temperature on Wrangel Island, I believe is minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, And so you're talking about having to survive in igloos, and they did bring some wall tents that, and they've got little Primus stoves, but there's a lot of, of hunkering around a small Primus stove. Luckily, they had these suits that Auntie and the kids had sewed, so that they have like Arctic pants, mucklucks, mittens, hooded parkas, or else they would freeze to death.
Auntie was one of the unsung heroes of the whole story, because she was constantly making winter clothing, warm clothing for the passengers. It seemed like she never stopped.
Well, right. And she also teaches them, the men, how to, the Inuit family already knew how, but like she teaches some of the scientists and some of the crew members how to sew them, because at a certain point it becomes clear that they didn't have enough, and some of the gear was on the other ship. So they're having to fabricate these things while they're drifting. And not only that, I will say that, and I say this in the book, Auntie and her husband Karluk, and Kataktovik, who goes with Bartlett, but on Wrangel Island, I believe everyone would have died without them, because they were incredibly industrious, excellent at hunting. Auntie was superlative at taking the rations that they did have and using every part of the seal. They were managing to catch birds, shorebirds, these auks or mures, and using every part of those birds. Auntie figured out how to use a sewing pin to jig for these tomcod fish in these little tidal cracks right down by the shore, and was being near the end of their time there was, catching 15 and 20 of these fish a day. And the kids were like figuring out how to use a little feather quill and put a piece of seal blubber on it, toss it on a line, and then have a seagull would go eat the blubber, and then they'd yank the seagull in and procure that. So, and also Karluk builds a kayak with William McKinley, one of the scientists on the mission or on the expedition, and is able to go out in this skin kayak, terrifying, because he's trying to go get a walrus, and the walrus are massive, and their tusks are dangerous, and Karluk is not really looking forward to this. He's the only one who knows how to use the kayak, and he's like, he kind of hems and haws for a long time. He's like, I don't want seal blubber's fine, I don't need a walrus. But he ends up going out there.
There's so many stories of bravery and resourcefulness and human ability to endure incredible situations. I think of myself, I think probably the first day the Karluk got caught in the ice, if I was on the ship, they would have found me frozen to death in my cabin. That was the end of James's story.
Well, I think Bartlett had a great skill at getting people, at rallying people. And it was interesting when you mentioned that, because after the ship sinks, Bartlett's organizational skills have everything is over there. And for the first few days and for the first couple of weeks while they're marooned on that ice floe, they're living large, they're eating really well. They've got all these tinned goods, and Bartlett is telling them to eat everything they can and everything they want, because he knows they're going to need their strength for this impending journey. But I think one of the things, James, that you learn in reading these kinds of stories is what people are capable of. Some crumble for sure, but also some rally in ways that they never knew they could. William McKinley, whose diary is instrumental in this book, is an example of that. He had never been to the Arctic. He came as a scientist to do, he was a magnetician. He was going to be taking readings. And the next thing you know, he becomes way more than he ever knew he could be. He surfaces as one of the leaders. When Bartlett leaves Wrangel Island, he leaves McKinley de facto in charge, even though in name Monroe is in charge. McKinley he learns how to ski. He learns how to make a skin kayak out of very little materials. He learns, because he's the one who helps Karluk build a kayak. He learns how to, survive and alone at certain times. He makes these amazing treks down to the southern part of the island to go help these others who are in worse condition. And you realize that, and it surfaces in the writing of his journal, how he became something much greater than he ever anticipated he could have been or believed he could have been.
Yeah, now that's a good segue here, because you mentioned about the journal, McKinley's journal. Your book is so well researched and so detailed, but detailed in a fascinating way. How hard was it to pull all this information together and put it into such a nice flowing story?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because that's the unseen part of these projects. The book, you read the book and you don't really see the behind the scenes hair pulling of because McKinley's journal is handwritten. It's, I think, 231 pages long, or more, a double-sided, single-spaced. But I was very fortunate, because since it was initially a scientific expedition, many of the members kept diaries and journals, and they were supposed to turn these back into Stefansson, actually, but those survived. And McKinley also ended up writing a lot of other things about it. But the journals and diaries are the main source that give you this incredible insight into not only the day-to-day just happenings, what they're doing every day, what they're eating, exactly what they're eating, how they got it. But also what I found most useful is the innermost thoughts and feelings and vulnerabilities and fears. So two of the main journals are McKinley and this Norwegian man named Bjarne Mammen, who was young and idealistic, and he had dreams of becoming a legendary explorer like some of his countrymen. And so he's really honest about his frailties and feelings of failure. And you also get to see what they're thinking about other people. So you get this sort of survivor on the fly voiceover thing where they're talking about other members, and they're telling you these two members are, planning a mutiny. there are silent conclaves and whisperings going on, and so it's really great, and that's what allows me to. I don't make up anything in this book. I mean, it's all the language of the people is what they wrote, and so it's all those diaries, and the same thing for Labyrinth of Ice, the book I wrote before, heavily influenced by personal journals and diaries, and that's what allows me to let the characters speak and to really bring out their characters.
Buddy, is there a message that you'd like the reader to come away with from your book?
What are you going to do when things go south up north? No, I mean, I think that I guess there's not a single message other than that. Well, here's the deal. In the front pages of the book, I have a quote by Bartlett and a quote by Stefansson, right? And they're juxtaposed with one another. And the quote by Bartlett goes like this: "Call it love of adventure, if you will, for as long as there is a square mile of the old Earth's surface that is unexplored, man will want to seek out that spot and find out all about it and bring back word of what he finds." And I think that's what has driven many explorers over history, and the search for knowledge, the quest for being the first, and the quest for the unknown, really. And so I think that this book is, in a way, a testament to that continuing quest, and we still have it, in our desire to find out what's happening on Mars, or to in all the ways that humans endeavor intellectually to learn about space, black holes. And I'll end with the quote of Stefansson's, which I include as a bit ironically, because he says, "An adventure is a sign of incompetence." And so my reading of that is that Stefansson thinks that if everything is organized and goes the way it should, there should be no adventure involved here, because everything should just play out the way you had planned it. But it's ironic in that this becomes such a quick catastrophe that he might have wanted to retract that statement later.
Oh, I agree 100%.
Yeah,
Well, those quotes say a lot about those two men. Here's another one for you, buddy. If you could go back in time and go to the saloon aboard the Karluk, how's that?
Yeah.
Have a hot buttered rum or a glass of ale or whatever they were drinking on the ship with one of the people who was on board that ship at that time. Who would it be, and what would you want to ask them?
Sure. It's the first thing that comes to mind is Stefansson, and I'd be like, after a couple of ales, I may say, look, okay, you're really planning to leave the ship. Like, are you, is that really what you want to do? Like, why? And I don't know, given what he said later, I don't know if he would have given me a straight answer, actually. But because Bartlett was such a straight shooter, and now Bartlett, I have to say, he was a little. So it's got to be Captain Bob Bartlett. That's got to be my guy that I would want to have some toddies with. The funny thing is, though, he is a little bit obfuscating himself, because he tells people mostly that he was a teetotaler, that he eschewed alcohol, but he gives booze to the other members on many occasions, like you said, and he ends up there's evidence that he was maybe being a little disingenuous about his actual consumption. But what I would like to talk to him about is, because he traveled so much, and he had been with Robert Peary to the North Pole, and that's really what I would want to talk to him about is, what it was like up there. He got to within 150 miles of the North Pole and was asked to turn back, and he dutifully did what Peary asked him to do. But he saw some things up there. He learned a ton from the Greenlandic people. They taught him how to put grasses in the bottom of his mucklucks to absorb moisture so you didn't get frostbitten. I mean, they were so far ahead of this, like, we Gore-Tex wicking stuff, like they already knew. But he also saw some incredible hardship. He watched Robert Peary. He actually helped the anesthetist when Peary came back from one of his forays a couple months into the north. Both of his feet were frozen, and they had to amputate 8 of Peary's toes. And Bartlett was standing right there while they're amputating his toes. So he was incredibly tough, and I just would have loved to talk to him about his experiences as a mariner, because prior to all of this, when he was younger, he had gone to Gibraltar and to South America, to Brazil. He'd gone all these as part of his apprenticeship. He'd sailed all over the world, and I would love to hear some of his stories about those journeys.
If only we had that time machine, right, buddy?
Yeah. Yeah.
Were there any lessons learned from the Karluk that helped future exploration of the Arctic? Were there any things that they looked at and said, hey, because that happened to that ship, these are the things we're going to do the next time?
I think it would be more what not to do. It's interesting, and that's why I brought up the Fram earlier. I'm going to look into this, because I don't know exactly why more. In this period, the mortality rate of most of these Arctic expeditions was nearly 50%. And, it starts to change a little bit after this because of technology, because we get ironclad icebreakers and also radio communication on ships. So this expedition in 1913 is kind of what's considered like the last of the dog sled explorations, right? So things begin to shift. And so I think yes, what they did learn was that, you need to have ships that can withstand the ice. And too many of them had just ended up at the bottom of the ocean. And so you begin to see no one taking these kind of risks without steel-hulled icebreakers and more powerful engines. But also, I think the lessons learned were that you need to be and part of this, again, Stefansson could not control the weather, but he did, by going off with the wrong men and the wrong equipment on the wrong ships. I think that was just a recipe for disaster, because they should have all been in the right ships to begin with, and it might have changed the outcome.
That would have made a lot more sense, definitely. And I got to find out from you then, buddy, what's next? You mentioned maybe another book about the Arctic. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, sure. I can't seem to get off the ice completely, but in this next book, it's called Realm of Ice and Sky, and I'm under contract with St. Martin's to write it. It's a book about I'm going to leave the surface of the ice and head up into the sky above the ice in what were called airships at the time. So we think of them as dirigibles or blimps now, but they were originally called airships, like the Graf Zeppelin and the Hindenburg, right? So this is before that. So my book concerns this American named Walter Wellman, who attempted to be the first person to fly an airship to the North Pole in 1905. And I follow him for a little while, and then his attempts and the airship's technological advances over the next couple of decades culminate in these remarkable journeys that involved an Italian named Umberto Nobile and a Norwegian, Roald Amundsen, the famous Norwegian, and they end up flying these dirigibles to the North Pole. So that's where I'm going to be for the next years, above the ice. Though I will say crashes occur, and they end up back on the ice.
Well, I can't wait for that one. If it's anywhere near as good as Empire of Ice and Stone, it's going to be great. How can people find out more about you and your other books, buddy?
Sure. Yeah, I do have a website. It's buddyleby.com, and that's a good place to start. And then my books are typically sold at independent booksellers, wherever books are sold, and of course on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all those places. But yeah, there's a bit of bio and stuff at buddyleby.com, so come visit.
Definitely. And one more for the road. One more question for the road. Has there been any discovery in modern times of the campsites where the survivors of the Karluk were camped out? Has there been any findings there?
Wow, that's a really great question. So just to backtrack for a second, the book I wrote, Labyrinth of Ice, that was a military expedition, and they built this. It was called Fort Conger. It was in this little inlet on northern Ellesmere Island across from Greenland, and that dwelling stayed there for many, many years, and there's still remnants of it. Unfortunately for the Karluk and survivors, when they built Shipwreck Camp, it was on a floating floe of ice, and that thing was eventually going to be obliterated and absorbed by the polar seas. And also, their dwellings on Wrangel Island were temporary because they were tents or igloos, and over time, the island consumed them. But but I will say something kind of cool about Wrangel Island is that it remains it's a UNESCO World Wildlife Site. It has the largest denning populations of polar bears and Pacific walrus breeding in the world, and it's this really hard to get to remote place that is only it's inhabited by like one or two scientists. It's under Russian occupation, I will call it, at the moment. There's been recent articles as recent as a few weeks or a month ago where there's a couple of American writers who have pointed out quite reasonably that the U.S. has a decent claim to this place, and so it's Wrangel Island is not. It's like 90 miles wide and 50 miles deep, but top to bottom. But it's really a compelling place, and I think people should check it out. Go look it up on Google Earth, and you realize, wow, they lived there for a while.
Oh, goodness. So next time I go take my dog out for a walk and it's like 33 degrees in New Jersey, I shouldn't complain.
No, that's when you just say hot and dusty.
Buddy, this has been a lot of fun and very interesting. And I really urge our listeners to look you up on your website and check out your books and Empire of Ice and Stone, The Disastrous and Heroic Voyage of the Karluk. Great book. Highly recommend it.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
The pleasure is mine. And thanks again. And I hope you have a great night.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.